Democratic Senator Chris Coons of Delaware. Senator, thank you for being with us on this Martin Luther King Day, an important day, very important day for the history of this country. Look, just listen to your fellow sitting senators who both said in a joint statement on Friday, asked if the president used that word, basically the S word, to describe these people. We do not recall. Here's what they said yesterday.
I'm telling you, he did not use that word, George, and I'm telling you, it's a gross misrepresentation.
I didn't hear it, and I was sitting no further away from Donald Trump than Dick Durbin was, and I know what Dick Durbin has said about the president's repeated statements is incorrect.
Senator David Perdue and Senator Tom Cotton, they're saying that Senator Dick Durbin is lying. What do you say?
Well, Poppy, on this Martin Luther King Day, rather than get too far into the he said back and forth here, I believe Senator Durbin and Senator Lindsey Graham, both of whom put out clear statements following their interaction with the president that demonstrated, I think, that we are dealing here with a tale of two Trumps, with a president who a week earlier has a positive, open, constructive, bipartisan meeting in which he says he'll sign any reasonable deal, any deal, he said, that they are able to bring back to him. And then this second meeting where he's not only closed-minded, but says things that are offensive, racially insensitive, and strongly at variance with our history as a nation. I agree with what Republican Senator Lindsey Graham said following that meeting, that the United States is an idea, not an ethnicity, and that our strength is that we have welcomed people from all nations, and that immigrants have strongly contributed to our country. And I choose to focus on the positive here. It's disappointing that this has dissolved into a fight of who said what at that meeting. What matters more is what we do next, because it's going to get even harder now for us to come together and reach any sort of an agreement on DACA. We've got a federal government that shuts down this coming week, this Friday, if we can't come to an agreement. And it's just getting harder when we have a president who, rather than tamping down our distances and disagreements, fans them and inflames them.
Okay, so a few things on that. You say focus on the positive, focus on advancing this country, not on dividing this country. Your fellow Democrat, Representative Jerry Nadler, who's going to be on the show a little bit later, he is proposing censuring the president, essentially, and he would need to get a majority on board with him to do that, but essentially a public reprimanding of the president for using this language. Do you believe that's productive, or do you oppose that?
Well, Congressman Nadler is, of course, free to take whatever step he thinks is required to emphasize that what President Trump is doing doesn't speak for a majority of Americans. Sadly, I doubt that motion of censure will pass in either chamber. We have a Republican majority, House and Senate, that has stood by the president. This is not the first time the president has said something that has taken us badly off track, or that speaks to the worst of America's historic negative impulses. And it frankly probably won't be the last time.
So
our challenge...
Go ahead.
Our challenge, Poppy, is to remember the spirit of Martin Luther King, who stood up to and confronted racism, but also was able to find a way to heal our country and to move it forward from its original sin, from the slavery and the racial segregation that was at the very founding of our nation. That's partly why he is so celebrated all across our country. And one of the things I hope we can do is to stop letting our president take control of our news media day in and day out with these winks and nods and innuendos that are nativist or racist, and that, frankly, we need to find a way to move forward.
So, Senator, on DACA, as you know, some of your fellow Democrats have said, even over the weekend, we will not support and give our vote for a funding bill to keep the government open this Friday if it doesn't include a deal for Dreamers, if it doesn't include a DACA agreement. Are you in that camp, or will you agree to something that keeps the government up and running, another continuing resolution, without a DACA deal?
And Poppy, at this point, we've got a long list of things that are way overdue. This is no way to run a government. And I remember back to the first days of this Congress when the majority leader said we'd get back to what we call regular order, which means moving things without crises, without cliffhangers. In addition to DACA, which we have to address, we have to provide
it sounds like you're
some
saying
confidence to these 800,000 people. Poppy, we also have to deal with, I'll remind you, unfunded hurricanes and wildfire response
Yes.
and unresolved.
But as you
we
know,
have
your
to
fellow
handle CHIP,
Democrats,
we have to,
some of your fellow Democrats say this is your moment of leverage. If you don't grab it by the
That's
horns
right.
this time and say we will not fund the government if you have no deal for Dreamers, no deal for DACA, we're going to lose all our leverage because you don't have the majority. It sounds like you will agree to fund the government without a Dreamer deal. Is that correct?
Poppy, a majority of my caucus, myself included, we will not fund the government without a DACA deal. The challenge is to make it clear to the American people this is not just about immigration. It's also about CHIP. It's also about community health centers. It's also about response to hurricanes. The Republican majority and the Republican president, to put a very sharp point on it, have failed to come up with a way that we can fund the government and address the vital needs of states and territories, of families and children all over this country. This isn't what folks want us to be doing in Washington, is to have yet another cliffhanger and possibly a government shutdown. No one wants to shut the government down. I don't want to shut the government down. But when the president has a meeting at the White House at his own invitation and brings together bipartisan leaders and says, you go find a deal, I'll sign it, anything that helps solve this DACA problem, and then a strong bipartisan group comes back with that deal, and he blows up the meeting and blows up the deal, it's hard to understand this as anything other than intentional sabotage of a responsible attempt by a good group of bipartisan senators led by Republican Lindsey Graham and Democrat Dick Durbin to solve this longstanding problem. And I'll remind you, a crisis of the president's own creating. The deadline that we're working up against for finding some resolution to the Dreamers, to the DACA situation, is an artificial one created by the president. Congress should take statutory action to put into law the protections that are previously administrative, and I support our making responsible compromises to get there. That's part of what we have to do in the Senate. But we've got so many other important things we also need to be moving forward on, Poppy, and that was the point I was trying to make. There's lots of issues that we should not move forward without having addressed and resolved.
All right, we'll be watching very closely this week. When you guys are all back at work tomorrow, you got 4 days to get this done. Senator Chris Coons, we appreciate it.
Thank you, Pop.
Chris.
Great interview. The point that you're making